Carol Markowitz, you have a brand new book out with Bethany Mandel entitled Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. I want to start with this trick I learned from a recent guest here on the Cain Podcast, Trey Gowdy. And he said, start at the end. He was largely talking about the way you should conduct your life. Think about your eulogy. Think about your obituary. Think about the story you want people to tell you or tell about you at the end. And then let's reverse engineer how we get to that story. I want to start with the end of your book, in a debate that I've been having with my Fox and Friends co-hosts, Rachel Campo-Stuffy and Pete Hegseth. And at the end of the book, where you talk about wokeness, but not just wokeness, an ideology that's made its way through every aspect of American culture that is attacking our youth, you and your co-author, Bethany, have different prescriptions for how to move forward.
Yeah. She
says leave, exit, homeschool, get off of pop culture. You say stay within the culture and fight. Tell me about your divide.
Hi, Will. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be on. It's a really interesting part of the conversation right now about what to do about the targeting of children. And Bethany and I do have different prescriptions on how to handle it. She has 6 kids that she homeschools. I have 3 kids, 2 in public, 1 in private. And our paths are different, but obviously our ending is the same. We want to raise resilient children who are not marked for this kind of indoctrination and aren't susceptible to it. So for me, I want to send my kids out into the world and know that they're going to be secure in themselves and not worry about somebody else's opinion or having to adjust their opinion to make other people feel comfortable. Bethany says, it's too late. Exit the culture. It's just, you have to protect your family, and you have to just do what you have to do. And I get that. I really do. But that solution just doesn't work for everyone. So you mentioned Pete Hegseth. I recently heard him speak in Colorado, and he gave this amazing talk on education. I was really riveted. But I really disagreed with something that he said, which was pull your children out of government schools, leave them behind. If your local public school is not working for you in whatever manner, and you have another option, take it. Sure, go ahead. Charter school, private school, parochial schools, do it. If something works better for your child, take that path. But the great majority of American children go to public schools. So we can't simply abandon these schools and hope for the best for our society. It's just not going to work out that way. So while you may have an option, but you very well may not. I talk to people who run charter schools. They're often running 500 plus wait lists. So not every kid gets the option to opt out of these public schools. So we have to fight for them, and we have to save them now.
And I have, either just through inertia, Carol, or by choice, I have largely taken your path. And it's a path that those two, my friends, give me a hard time about. They say, Will, I can't believe you would send your kids to school, much less pay for it, that would, for example, think that required reading curriculum would be the biography of Trevor Noah. When we know that, education is zero-sum game. And you write it in your book, you talk about every minute given to one piece of curriculum, one book, is a minute not given to another. But I've largely followed your path, Carol, and I think a lot of it is because of cultural inertia, because it's the way I grew up. I grew up within the system. I went to public schools.
Right.
I played sports, and it's hard to sort of pull the ripcord on that cultural inertia. But one of the things you guys lay out in your book is you are absolutely engrossed in it, engulfed in it. Everyone listening, your children, your life is inundated with this woke ideology.
That's right. So for Bethany, for example, what she'll say is, even though she's pulled her children out of public and private schools, even though she monitors very closely what they read and what they watch on TV, all of that is true, but she still has to go to the pediatrician. And when she gets to the pediatrician, that pediatrician went to a medical school where they were taught woke medicine, where there's a very narrow way of looking at any problem. And if you step outside the line on that problem, you can be targeted to lose your license. We've seen it happen. So no matter how much you pull out of culture, it's it won't be enough. And so, like, to paraphrase the, culture, you might not be interested in culture, but culture is interested in you. And that's really where we are. So as much as you want your kids out of the woke, world, it's very tough because so much around us has gone woke. They've marched through our institutions and they've taken over in so many different ways. So again, I am also a big believer in doing what you have to do for your kids. We famously moved to Florida last year, and it was a tough move. It wasn't an easy call. Inertia would have kept us in New York. So I get the argument that you have to do what you have to do for your child's short childhood. And in somewhere like Florida, public school is actually better protected than private school because Governor DeSantis bans a lot of woke nonsense in the public schools. But the private schools he has no control over. And that ends up being a situation where the government schools are actually safer for your kid.
You talk about it in the book. You lay out all the different areas of America, not just education, reading lists, libraries, medicine, pediatrician's office, obviously psychology offices, every aspect of our culture. And we both have used this term several times, is captured by woke ideology. But I think it's probably important for anyone listening, and they're probably asking themselves, or maybe they're not asking themselves, and they're simply accepting that they have some idea of what it means to be woke. But I don't know that anyone truly does understand the definition. Did you see that clip of Bill Maher and Bernie Sanders talking about the definitional difference between equality and equity? And Bernie Sanders didn't know. And this would be one of your primary proponents of equity. And he couldn't definitionally give you the difference between equality and equity. So I think it's important for everybody listening for you to tell us what you mean by woke.
So we explain it a lot in the book, but the short kind of version that I usually give is what separates leftism from wokeness. The old leftists, sure, they had some really kooky beliefs, and sure, they spread it around college campuses. And, maybe you didn't want your kids to learn that then either. But the new wokeness does not allow these leftists to even say what's on their mind. They cannot even speak freely because there's only one way to speak about anything. There's only one way to address any one issue. And it always comes back to like racism or the patriarchy, etc. Wokeness is a conformity of thought that the old leftism was not. And another shortened example that I like to give is the old leftism is getting a women's studies degree. The new wokeness is not knowing what a woman is and getting that women's studies degree. So it's like a new way of forcing the conversation, and force is a big part of it, because I know it doesn't seem this way, but wokeness and leftism is extremely unpopular. Only like 7% of the country considers themselves very liberal. So every time you think like, oh, I'm the only one who thinks this way. No, 97% of the country, bad at math. 93% of the country thinks the exact same way you do.
Well, then how do you explain that? And I thought that was a fascinating poll you reflect in the book from Gallup, that so few people actually identify with the far left and woke ideology. Yeah. Then why? Then why is it in every aspect of our society?
They're very loud, and what they do is instill fear. Basically, they start with their own side. So what I always used to say was, I can't be canceled. You're not going to call my boss and tell them that I did something and have me canceled. That's just unlikely to happen. But if you're a liberal, you're much easier to cancel. You can really target people. The left can target people on their own general side and force them into having the same opinion as them. I think leftists target liberals often, and they make them conform to their ideas. So what they do is they're very loud and they push through what they want, and they don't stop until they get it. And a lot of these methods have been backfiring lately, but for a long time they didn't. For a long time, these corporations would immediately cower and do whatever they wanted them to do. And they portray this vision of their path is the righteous and good path, and anybody who disagrees with them, is possibly racist, possibly, sexist, possibly any other names that they like to call them. And it's tough to beat that back. I mean, something that I saw a lot was during the pandemic when opening schools was happening all over Europe. And you even had these like people on the left being like, wait, why aren't we opening schools? How come we're the only ones not doing this? And you would have these woke people come in and be like, you want teachers to die. And they called people's bosses and said this kind of thing. It's scary. And they scared a lot of people off from talking about it. I saw the people get barraged in Facebook groups and just shut their mouths and be quiet about what their kids, were missing out in school, and didn't just get their kids a tutor or form a pod or send them to private school and not mention it again, because that was the way that they were taught that they had to handle it.
School closings is an interesting place to talk about the concept of woke ideology. I think when most people think about it, they think about it in terms of race, because it was sort of Black Twitter that first popularized the concept. And I mean that popularized because I know it was around long before this, but popularized the concept of woke. But it's not just about race. It's not just about trans ideology. And as you point out, it can be involved in school closures or medicine. Let's take medicine for just a moment. So I'm taking my kid to the pediatric office. Where and how am I? And I want to be a normal person. I'm not politically active.
Yeah.
Where and how am I experiencing a woke doctor?
So one way would be, depending on how old your child is, if the doctor's asking you to leave the room and you're not comfortable with that, and you say no and the doctor insists on it, that's a classic example of a woke doctor who's going to have conversations with your child that you might not be comfortable with. If they're asking your 12 or 13-year-old if they're sexually active, you might not want them to have that conversation with the doctor. And there's a lot of examples where the doctor will keep secrets with the child, and we just can't have that. Even though the doctor may think that they're doing, what's best for the kid, it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to me. It's not acceptable to a lot of parents. And where it really comes to a head is with transgender ideology. The doctors are taught in medical school that the only way to handle a child who declares themselves transgender is to affirm them and say, yes, you are transgender. What would you like to do next about it? Do you want us to change your name? Do you want to present more like the opposite sex? Do you want to get on hormone blockers? And all of this is happening. And if it's happening outside the parents' purview, to me, that is a gigantic problem. And I think that we can't keep pretending that like these doctors are not in on what's going on. And that's really the issue to me.
What do you think's going on? You and I went to dinner together last night. We talked a lot about many of these issues. What do you think's going on with the trans contagion? Why, it seems to be, and you pointed this out to me last night, it's geographically unique. In other words, why is it more prevalent in the Northeast than say it might be in Florida? People don't talk about this because as much attention as the male individuals participating in female sports gets attention, it's really, really prevalent among young girls. So what do you think is going on with this whole trans movement?
And also, it's not happening in Europe at anywhere near the level that it's happening in the U.S. So that on its own, and you can't, so you might be able to point to the South and say like, oh, they're just not accepting enough, and that's why you're not seeing as many trans kids. But Europe's pretty accepting, and it's not happening there either. I think what's going on is that we've done this thing in America where you're checking your privilege, right? You're constantly checking your privilege. Are you privileged? You might be in trouble if you are. And then you have these kids who maybe they grew up in the suburbs. Maybe they have nothing, about them that is that could be considered not privileged. Maybe they had a nice life. Suddenly they have an easy into being a protected class, into being a category which is cool. I always say this, if this was happening when I was in high school, I 100% would declare myself non-binary, have my teacher call me a different, pronoun every day, because why not? It's a lot of power for a kid. And so that's part of it. And then the other part is teenagers are uncomfortable in their bodies a tale as old as time. And now you're giving these young women an out. You're not uncomfortable in your body. You're just a boy. And that's why you're uncomfortable in your body. And that becomes just an easy way for them to exit their problems and not really pay attention to what is going on with them. And to get social cred where suddenly there's something interesting about them. There's something unique. And all of this is just leading to this contagion taking hold where, it's happening in clusters because they're encouraging each other, because they're influencing each other. I heard of a family recently, or like yesterday or something, it was in the news, where like 3 out of the 4 kids are trans. I'm sorry, that is mathematically impossible. Like, look at the number of trans people in history. You don't have 75% ever showing up as trans. So it's clearly an influence. And that's why parents are so concerned about it. People will always say like, oh, if we teach our kids about homosexuality, that won't make them gay. All right, maybe it won't make them gay, but teaching them about trans ideology does make them trans. It turns out that it does make them want to change their gender. And if you're not teaching it, if you're not influencing them with it, then like in places like in Europe, they're not going to be adapting it.
So I think you're absolutely spot on the idea that it's a social contagion. I mean, if we did a heat map, as you point out, the fact that heat map wouldn't show anything in Europe shows there's something, like, it defies the concept that it's a biological genetic issue. It defies that logic. Why would it be uniquely spreading in the United States of America? So then you wrestle with the fact that it's a social contagion. And you said something that I find fascinating. We clearly have incentivized victimhood. We've clearly incentivized this as a grasp for power, because being traumatized is a path to being unique. My wife is reading something, and I don't know the name of it right now, but she shared with me a passage where she said that kids these days see their trauma as their personality. It is what makes them unique. Whereas in the past, we might have sought something, a skill, or even a trait, kindness, whatever it may be, to help form our identity into what makes us unique in our social setting. Now your trauma is your path to individuality. And so whatever's happened to you in your life, it is you, and you force it out front. You wear it on your sleeve. And that's how you get, as you said, social credit.
Right. And it protects you from criticism, because how dare somebody target somebody who's gone through this trauma? And it inoculates you from so much about leftist culture. It's like they are constantly like looking for new targets, and you will be passed over as a target because you're so obviously damaged and so obviously have this issue, that you won't be one of their, targets. And that's a big draw. The other thing is, let's say we say, okay, this is just a phase that young teenage girls go through. Like, let's say this is just a weird phase for some reason that our civilization has picked up. The left could admit that this is a phase and end this tomorrow, right? What teenager wants to be told, oh, you're just going through a phase? None, right? They want to be affirmed. They want to be like, yeah, you're totally non-binary. Everybody's born boy or girl, but not you. You happen to be the unique individual born in, neither gender or both genders or whatever you're deciding today. If the left said, yeah, this is a social contagion, we can just wait this out and see, what happens, I think it would just end, and it would be so much better for society. Instead, they're saying, no, it's real. Every single one of these cases is real. Even when you have like 6 girls in the same, Girl Scout troop coming out as trans, and we need to affirm that by putting them on hormone blockers, which have lifelong consequences. The crazy thing that they're sticking to this ideology, even when they know it's insane, is really what is so scary here.
Do you think they do? Do you think that much of the left that's embraced this knows it's insane?
I think a lot of them do. And I think that they quietly admit this when, nobody's listening, because I hear them say it, that they oh, this is just a phase. Okay, if it's just a phase, say that it's just a phase. And then, we can all help these people move through this phase together. Instead, they're like, no, it's not a phase. And you right-wingy crazies are trying to like harm trans kids. So if they wanted to help these kids, they would admit what they know, and they don't.
The they in our conversation is important for us to actually kind of dig in on and define. And I think you said this last night when we were together. It's really easy to be sympathetic to the parent that's trying to be empathetic to the child, because what's happening in many of these situations is the child is threatening suicide. They are threatening self-harm. Right. And then the parent is looking at this phase of non-binary as a way to avoid that worst outcome that can be imagined by any parent. Right. But that's when we're thinking about the they in terms of the parent. Then there's the removed ideological leftist, and that's a different they. And I think it's easy for them to be theoretical and ideological if it doesn't impact their family. And so then I wonder, Carol, and you do talk about this in the book, you talk about you have a chapter on child soldiers, and this is broader than trans. You talk about, for example, school shootings and using children as the voice of authority when it comes to the Second Amendment. So I have to wonder, I often think, Carol, the left is driven by empathy, and I want to give the best I can. I don't want to be someone who cynically robs my opponent of their best motivations, right? And I do think many on the left see the world through the prism of empathy, but not everyone. Others see it through a cold ideological prism. Either way, I come back to this, like, what is driving all of this? And it's not, again, now we're not talking about just trans, unless you want to address the parents, but we're talking about the theoretical removed leftist. What is driving that person?
Right. I also try to give people the benefit of the doubt, but in writing this book really shook me. And I no longer think that necessarily the great majority of the left are trying to do the best thing for everybody and just getting it wrong. We took a deep dive into history of totalitarian regimes and how they target children. And they all thought they were doing the best thing, right? Severing the connection between parent and child so that the child can more easier understand the troubles of the working class. And it just, this kind of thing where they're like, we're doing this for the kid's own good. It just always works out that they have to cut the parents out. And that's what's happening today. I see the direct link between these two things. And the history really matters because I do think it's the same ideological push. It's the collectivist targeting of young children to make them into the perfect leftist society that they hope to bring about. I don't know that every individual who believes woke nonsense is like thinking about the larger Marxist, path, but they've all been indoctrinated into it themselves. And that's really what we learned, is that if you had told me at the beginning of this that teachers' colleges are actually being taught actual Marxism as a way of teaching kids, I would have been like, well, that sounds crazy. I have to look that up. And now it turns out that that's true. They're using Marxist texts at teachers' colleges so that the teachers themselves are getting indoctrinated and then going and passing it on to the kids. How is this not happening by design? How is this an accident? How is it that the in China, they call it the main melody, and that's like the one government message is in all of their arts, all of their movies, all of everything. How is that happening in America in the exact same way where everything has the main melody of leftism? How is that happening by accident? It can't be. So I think I used to be just a lot more understanding of other people's perspectives. COVID really, part of that was what really shook me, because I saw that they did not care about the actual results that were clearly happening, and they had to stay strong with the ideology. The ideology said that the teachers' unions wanted the schools closed. Therefore, even though we knew it was going to harm the poorest children, they had to keep schools closed. And when you service your ideology before the reality and before the needs of kids, I can no longer give you the benefit of the doubt.
Oh, I think you're absolutely correct. And while I want to grant the benefit of the doubt and goodwill to individuals, I can't when it comes to institutions. You do a good job in the book talking about teachers' colleges, accreditation agencies for every one of our children's school, whether or not you're public or private. Pretty much all schools, not all, but pretty much all schools subscribe to these accreditation agencies, which are also indoctrinated in these philosophies. And I should say, while I want to grant individuals, the benefit of the doubt, I described on the trans issue a certain kind of parent. There are other kinds of parents that I think are also trying to use or create their children's trauma for their own unique virtue. When you point out the family that has 3 trans kids out of 4, that's not a parent who's simply trying to find their kid's way through teenager years without experiencing a suicide. There's something else going on there where I think parents are wearing children as sort of like jewelry. Look how virtuous I am. But I do think there's all these other people out there, Carol, and I think these are most of the people you and I know. I'm talking about, and everyone listening.
Yeah.
when we experience somebody out there in the world who says, Will, come on, think about what Black people have had to endure in this country, right? And then they're more open to Ibram X. Kendi, or they're more open to ambiguous concepts of woke ideology. Not only do I think they are unaware of the Marxist designs you described, that it's now baked into all these institutions, they think it sounds like conspiracy.
Yeah, but then, Governor DeSantis pulls an AP course in Florida on Black history because it has things like queer ideology in it, or BLM, or Marxism in it, and somehow that becomes a story about him canceling Black history. So again, it's like I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, and it was popular media. I forgot her name, the woman who was just accused him of this. A really famous newscaster accused DeSantis of trying to get rid of Black history. And obviously that's not the truth. He was trying to get rid of this Marxist strain that for some reason is aimed specifically at Black people in so many different ways. And yet, I'm Jewish. If you taught me a Jewish history course that had unrelated nonsense, I would be offended, and I would find that offensive and think that this course is not meant to represent my history. It's meant to represent something else entirely. And I don't care if I agreed with the ideology being pushed. I don't care if you drew me a picture about conservative ideology through Jewish history. I'd be like, no, this is crazy. This is just not acceptable. And that's what's happening in so many places. They just insert this Marxist thought into all these different areas. BLM is another example where Black Lives Matter, of course Black Lives Matter. What does Marxism have to do with it? What does destruction of the family have to do with it? And if you don't accept it, as it is, then you don't think Black Lives Matter, because you didn't accept the full package of insanity that this group offers.
And that ignorance, by the way, Carol, you're exactly right about Black Lives Matter. And obviously somebody like yourself or me has invested in understanding the philosophical underpinnings. And it's not very hard, by the way, because there are manifestos published behind the concept of Black Lives Matter. But intelligent individuals, like, for example, Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban, would say, no, come on. Again, with the implication that you or I are being conspiratorial, it's a more nebulous phrase that affirms the experience and the unique position of Black lives in America. And I do think that Mark Cuban's perspective on that wins the day right now. I mean, I think most people don't understand. And by the way, we should point out, you hinted at it a moment ago, you're an immigrant from the Soviet Union. So your family history, recent family history, your parents and grandparents have understood institutional capture and ideological indoctrination in a way where it's not so conspiratorial to think this stuff has a philosophical basis and it's baked into the institutions.
And forced conformity by your friends and neighbors. It's not always the government forcing you to have a very narrow point of view. Sometimes it's your culture around you. Mark Cuban, I would love to see him take a controversial stand that's controversial on the left and see what happens to him. Because you see what happens to people like Bill Maher. They end up being, red-pilled. I've never seen the movie, so for lack of a better term, red-pilled into believing, that everything that they've realized, everything that they thought about the left was untrue. So Mark Cuban can believe whatever he wants, but the first time that he steps outside of leftist ideology, they will come for him, and they will come for him in a really serious way. And he'll see that it's like the same forced conformity that was going on all around him. And also the reason that we wrote this book, or a big reason for me, was, and why I needed to include that history chapter that opens with my great-grandfather dying in a gulag in the Soviet Union, and the way that, this forced conformity was just a part of my family's history. I needed to include that because I see the same path happening in the U.S. And the thing is that in those countries, in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia, in China, all these countries that I mentioned in the history chapter, the people there could have said, we didn't know. We didn't know. We didn't realize what was happening. We didn't realize how much of this forced conformity was being pushed on us. We didn't realize that, people were really being targeted like this. But this book is to say, if you don't know, now you know. And there's no way that you could say, oh, I didn't know this was happening to kids. I didn't know that they were doing this at teachers' colleges. I didn't realize that medical schools had become so woke. Well, here it is. Now you know.
Carol, why did your great-grandfather get sent to the Gulag?
He owned a bakery, and overnight that became illegal. It was a bakery that him and his wife had owned for a long time, and the rules just shifted, and that was it. And so that's, it's a story that I grew up with. And the additional thing there is, like, I was raised by my grandmother and her sister in Brooklyn, along with my parents. And that was his two daughters. And they had the mark of, like, a traitor, that they knew that something had happened in their family that had damaged their reputation. And that kind of thing, is so scary to me. Your kids can be targeted because of something you said or did. And said is a lot more powerful in the US. Like, in America, we'll forgive a murderer way before we'll forgive, like, a racist, for example. And that is such a terrifying concept to me, that the kids of somebody who did something wrong will carry this mark. But I saw it in my own family. And again, that thread that I'm seeing that's happening in the US, I'm worried that part will come too.
It seems like in America, all of this ideology focuses in two primary places. One is the workplace, probably through HR departments, but through the workplace, through cancellation, getting people canceled from their jobs. That's a large enforcement mechanism for this ideology. But the second is kids, as you laid out in your book. It's through education. And it focuses seemingly on where we work and who we raise. Why is that?
I think those are just the places that it's easier to target you. So many people told me that they didn't want to speak up during the school closures in New York because they were afraid of being targeted at their jobs. And that happened. Jennifer Say, famously, she didn't get fired from Levi's, but she quit her job because she was being pushed out because she argued for school closures. And Levi's, the company, had said, oh, bring your whole self to work. If you're a protester of something, we're with you. But not this. You protested wrong. You protested the wrong thing, and now you're out. I've written about other people who were fired during COVID for saying really things that we now know to be true, but things that we knew to be true even then. And so many of these people just lost their livelihood, and other people saw it happen and got the lesson. I can't do the same thing. I have a family. I can't do this. I have to take care of my family.
Well, the book is awesome. It's focused in 4 parts: education, which we've talked about here today; institutions in trouble, where you talk about institutions like Disney and medicine. Part 3, kids as guinea pigs. This is largely about the transgender crusade, but not just that. As we talked about earlier, the idea of child soldiers, turning kids into advocates and experts on any given issue and separating them from their parents. And then finally, as we mentioned at the beginning, part 4, where do we go from here? Both of your different prescriptions on how to deal with this attack on our kids. It's, again, Stolen Youth, How Radicals Are Erasing Innocence and Indoctrinating a Generation. I really enjoyed the book. I've always enjoyed our relationship. I think you're a unique and independent thinker. I truly believe that, and something that everyone should read, starting with, if they haven't already, this book, Stolen Youth. Carol, thank you so much.
Let's go Cowboys.
All right, Carol, awesome.
Thank you, Will. That was great. Thank you so much.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.